What they did. Past research has shown the 50,000 children who were evacuated from Finland during World War II were more likely to experience mental illness than those who were not. To control for prior existing genetic tendencies towards mental illness, the researchers looked at the rates of hospitalization among the descendants of first cousins, 3,000 children who were descended from evacuees, and over 90,000 who were descended from siblings who stayed. What they found: daughters of women who were evacuated were 4 times more likely to be hospitalized for mental illness compared to the first cousins who stayed. This trend held true regardless of whether or not the mothers had been hospitalized for mental illness. It was not true for male offspring of the descendants of men. Take note, because the study is retrospective, it's impossible to capture all the possible variables impacting the children. And since the study looks at hospitalizations for mental illness, it may be underestimating the scope of the problem, since mental illnesses are often underreported, particularly in men. Still, a large sample size and strong associations help account for some of these challenges. The researchers weren't able to determine the cause for this trend, but they suggest 2 possibilities: the experience of being evacuated may have impacted the parenting behaviors of the subjects in the study, or that stories of experienced trauma influenced the mental health of their children. Or, intriguingly, this could be due to epigenetics, sometimes inheritable changes in which genes are activated. Essentially, cells control which genes are turned on in a cell by attaching or detaching a molecule that can prevent the piece of DNA from being read. Past research has shown a physiological response to famine can be passed down across generations. One study found that the descendants of Holocaust survivors have different hormonal responses to stress, and another study from the same lab suggested epigenetics may explain why. Go deeper. Rachel Yehuda, an author on both papers on multi-generational mental health impacts in Holocaust survivors, notes the gender trends could indicate something epigenetic is at work. Past research has shown mothers can pass on certain epigenetic changes while pregnant. The bottom line: epigenetics is a fledgling field, and the epigenetics of mental health is even younger. But, notes Yehuda, data like these really help make the argument that the effects of war are devastating, well beyond the actual exposure, and potentially for generations after, whether it be genetic or otherwise. Key takeaways per Alexander Kellner, one of the study's authors and a paleontologist at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Pterosaur eggs have a fragile, almost leathery exterior, so the fact that they were preserved in fossils tells us that whatever killed the dinosaurs happened fast, Kellner says. The volume of eggs found at the site and the discovery across layers of the ground suggests pterosaur mothers nested communally and repeatedly returned to the same nesting ground. The bones in pterosaur hatchlings' wings were less developed than the femur bones, indicating pterosaurs may not have been able to fly immediately after hatching. They may have needed assistance from adults to survive in the earliest stages of life. But that interpretation depends on the stage of development captured by the discovered embryo fossils, Habib said. If the embryos were only partially developed, it's unclear what the wings and legs were like at hatching. Also, in some cases, the bones in embryos' wings were larger, and therefore likely mechanically stronger than the femur bones, even though they were less developed, he said. This could indicate the hatchlings were indeed capable of flight at birth. One caveat: of the 16 embryos scientists found, several were incomplete. Kellner believes more such egg fossils exist at the site in China because it appears to have been a popular nesting ground for pterosaurs. More fossils will solidify scientists' conclusions about pterosaurs' development. A reconstructed image showing the hatching of a pterosaur, based on evidence presented in the study. Illustration: Aurelio Oliveira. How it works. Classical computers can handle 2 states of information, as 0s and 1s of binary code. Quantum bits or qubits, analogous to the bits in classical computers, are made of atoms, silicon, or superconducting materials, and can represent multiple states of information at the same time. A quantum computer can perform computations on these different states simultaneously, but in the end gives one solution. A 50-qubit system can collectively store more than a quadrillion possible states in the atoms at the same time. Increasing the number of qubits exponentially increases the number of possible configurations and therefore the machine's processing power. Researchers are trying to build ever bigger but still controlled systems in hopes of eventually putting together tens of thousands or millions of qubits that can solve a range of problems exponentially faster than a conventional computer. Reality check. The recent demonstrations are simulations of specific problems, not computations. The researchers solved some arguably esoteric physics problems, says Christopher Monroe, a quantum physicist at the University of Maryland who led work on one of the simulators, but are an illustration of the types of hard problems quantum computers can take on. The big picture: the goal of quantum computing is to create a machine that can solve a range of problems a classical computer cannot. The reality is currently just a handful of qubits can be controlled well enough to perform computations. One approach then is to first build quantum simulators that can use a larger number of well-controlled quantum qubits to solve specific problems in order to figure out how best to then try to design a universal quantum computer. And, along the way, being able to build quantum systems that can be completely controlled may allow researchers to understand the physics of systems we don't have access to, says Stephen Bartlett, a quantum physicist at the University of Sydney who wasn't involved in either of the studies. That could prove useful in designing drugs or optimizing chemical processes, problems that currently occupy supercomputers. What's exciting about these two new experiments is they have managed to get up to 50 qubits while keeping a high level of control over the system. It's not everything you would want, and the control is different between the two, but it is much more than we had a few years ago, says Bartlett. The experiments Hannes Bernstein and his colleagues at MIT, Harvard and Caltech used 51 uncharged atomic qubits. They built the system atom by atom in a vacuum chamber using lasers to hold each atom in place. One advantage of their approach is that because they can adjust the lasers independently, they have control over the atoms to encode the problems they are trying to solve. Another plus is they suspect it may be easier to add more qubits to the design. A team from the University of Maryland and National Institute of Standards and Technology (NIST) led by Monroe used 53 electrically charged atoms as the qubits and applied a force via a laser so the atoms either align with others nearby to create a magnet or point in random directions. The researchers can then change the strength of the laser and determine the boundary of conditions where matter becomes magnetic. Because the atoms are interacting with one another, the researchers have a sort of global knob of control over them. One advantage of this setup is the qubits can be stable for several hours rather than milliseconds. While IBM and Google are working with superconducting materials, which benefit from years of research and development related to their use in today's computers, Monroe is an advocate for the atom approach in part because they are all identical. Good quantum hardware is composed of systems you can replicate, he says. A big question once you get a result: how do you corroborate it is right? You can't compare it to a classical computer, asks Alexander Kiesling from the Harvard team. It's an active area of discussion and one to watch for as quantum computers move out of university labs and into the commercial space where a buyer will want to know they are getting what is advertised. Some possibilities for validating include cross-checking simulations in smaller quantum systems with conventional computers, or using multiple different simulators to see if they agree on the results. Semma Therapeutics has raised $114 million in a new funding round that will help the biotech startup test its novel treatment for type 1 diabetes in humans. Cowen, which just financed $108 million for its healthcare venture capital fund, called the round with 8 Roads Ventures. Why it matters if Semma succeeds with its research and technology, which uses stem cells to generate insulin-producing cells. It would create a breakthrough medicine for people who have type 1 diabetes, which is rarer than type 2 and cannot be prevented. The sci-fi stuff in the future, we might be engineering bacteria that can create a molecule in response to a cue from their environment. For example, it could be possible to make ones that respond to low blood sugar by creating insulin. go deeper were just starting to explore the potential of synthetic biology. Among other things, scientists have in an interview Monday, Russian cosmonaut Anton Shkaplerov reported bacteria had been found on the outside of the International Space Station ISS, and it hadn't been there when the ISS modules launched. Instead, the microorganisms swabbed from the cracks and crevices of the space station had come from outer space, he said. But the details of the analysis are so far thin. And in a previous mission, bacteria from Earth made it to the space station via a tablet, supporting the possibility of contamination this time, too. Recent research also seems to indicate microbes can get kicked high above Earth in space dust and by other space weather events, which offers another very plausible reason for how bacteria wound up on the ISS hull. The bottom line: the bacteria probably came from Earth itself. Microbes are still partying at 9 miles up and have been found as high as 47 miles above the surface, Mary Griggs wrote in Popular Science. How it works: the system analyzes a patient's health records in comparison to data from about 2 million other patients collected over nearly 20 years and then makes a prediction about the patient's mortality. It also produces a report explaining how the patient's prescribed medications, the length of hospital